Hello, my name is Steve Coleman. I'm an associate professor of soil fertility at Ohio State. And today I'm going to give you a broad overview of the work that we've been doing over the last 6-7 years to update and revise the Tri-State Fertilizer Recommendations. This has been a major effort by a lot of people involved in the ag community. We can talk a little bit about that in a bit. But I'll just start by talking a little bit about some of the work that we've done, in particular with on-farm trials. This is a unique project in terms of the scale and how many people it involved. We ran field trials in 33 counties across Ohio. The shaded counties here are the ones that we were in over the course of 5 years. Our target really was corn, soybean, and wheat for our crops. And we looked at nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and we did a little bit of sulfur work. So our philosophy was to cast as broad as net as possible. We were looking at as many different soil types and diversity of management histories, et cetera, et cetera. Some of these fields that we were in had a history of manure, some not, a history of tillage, some were no-till, some had been cover crops, some hadn't. So there was quite a bit of diversity of soil and management practices involved. We worked directly with farmers. We worked with crop consultants, with a lot of county educators from the Ohio State University, some soil and water educators, co-op agronomists, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of people with their fingers in this project. Okay, we let growers choose source, rate, timing, and placement. And we ask them to pick your crop, tell us the nutrients you want to work with, and then just work it into your system. The main difference of either applying different rates of nitrogen or applying no phosphorus plus phosphorus, no potassium plus potassium, et cetera, et cetera. For most of the trials, we sampled 0 to 8 inches for soil sampling. We did a leaf and grain nutrient concentration. We, of course, measured grain yield to ask that basic question: does fertilizer produce a crop response? And then we had a detailed management survey to understand fully what their farming operation was like. All that said, I'm going to just start with a summary of the major changes across the Tri-State document. Okay, so we've updated the core nitrogen recommendations. I'm going to get into each one of these here in a little bit. The framework for phosphorus potassium management has been updated a bit and simplified, just tweaked slightly. Malic 3 is now the default soil test extractant that we will use moving forward. Critical P levels for all crops essentially remain unchanged, with the major exception that it's now based on a Malic 3 or an M3 soil test extraction. We've simplified, to some extent, critical K levels into 2 primary CEC classes, or sandy soils versus loam and clay soils. And then our nutrient removal rates per bushel have decreased. In other words, the concentration of nutrients in the grain has decreased, particularly with potassium. Again, all this we're going to talk about over the next 30 minutes. What has changed, or what has not changed yet, what's consistent with the 1995 version? Line recommendations essentially remain the same. Our P and K buildup equations have not changed. Our leaf tissue sufficiency levels have not been updated. Sulfur, calcium, magnesium, and micronutrients. In other words, our secondary nutrients and our micronutrient recommendations essentially remain consistent. Okay, so that's the high level overview. And now I'm going to get into a little bit more of the detail. Okay. And I'm just going to do this essentially, if you are familiar with the 1995 version, this is essentially just kind of progressing through it. Soil sampling strategies and pH management. Well, not much of this has changed. You know, we can't really emphasize enough that good nutrient recommendations start with a quality soil sample. Taking the time to take a quality soil sample is really, really important. We suggest that we sample soils consistently each time so we can actually have an idea of what's happening with those soil test levels, this idea of adaptive nutrient management, where you see how your management is changing fertility and then adapting to that. The recommendation remains the same of sampling every 3 to 4 years. We want soil samples to represent no more than 25 acres. Of course, a lot of growers are moving to high density grid sampling. We encourage this, 2.5 acre grids or less, but no more than 25 acre grid samples, okay? There's really no major changes to the liming recommendations. There are some kind of nuanced differences in the Tri-State document that's based on how different different Department of Ags in the 3 states, Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, actually handle and label lime. We're going to leave those details for later. If people are interested, you can dig into the document and get more of that detail. Okay. So I'm going to move on to corn nitrogen rates now. And essentially, the old nitrogen rates in the Tri-State Rec were based on kind of yield goals. We know that that is not a good way to manage nitrogen in corn. It's just not reliable, and there's not a good relationship in terms of how much nitrogen you put on versus what that optimal yield is going to be. Okay, so this is a framework that's consistent. Essentially, it's been adopted of all the land-grant universities across the Corn Belt. It's an economic model. So this is a model that very simple inputs. It just requires a few things to supply, and it's focusing on maximizing profitability and not yield. And so those things are highly related, of course, profitability and yield, but they're not the same thing. So this is a maximum return to nitrogen, and the return is in from a return on investment, or ROI, or an economic perspective, okay? Each state has its own recommendations from trials conducted in that respective state. That's a very important thing to know. It's a simple tool that can simply be viewed as a starting point for nitrogen recommendations, okay? It can be found here. It's hosted at the Iowa State University site, but again, this is data from Ohio is based on Ohio trials. Recommendations in Michigan are based on Michigan trials, et cetera, et cetera. If you go to that site, you'll find this. You can see the states in the Corn Belt that are involved shaded here. It asks for some very simple inputs. What's your expected price of nitrogen that you'll pay for nitrogen fertilizer? What do you expect to get for the grain? And what your previous crop is? And the idea is that we've got a typical nitrogen response, this blue line, which is a gross return to nitrogen. So that's what the nitrogen fertilizer is going to yield and return on a dollar per acre basis. But then we also have this large input cost when we grow corn, which is fertilizer nitrogen. This is your green line, okay? As that green line increases, we know that this blue line is going to, or this gross return is going to plateau as yields kind of drop off. We can add lots of nitrogen and we won't essentially get any greater yield. And so what this model essentially does, this red line is a net return. So this is our net in an economic perspective. It's your gross minus your input cost. And so we're trying to optimize this point, and that's our MRT and our maximum return to nitrogen. Okay, so again, lots of details here. We're glossing over it. The model will provide you a recommended rate as well as a profitability range. You can see it can be quite wide, right? Again, this is it should be viewed as a starting point. And in case Ohio growers don't want to go to that site and do that, click on this model and play around with it. Here's just a simple table that provides, again, this concept of we take into consideration what you're paying for nitrogen fertilizer on a per pound basis, and then what you expect to get for your corn that you're raising. And so in this case, this is data that's based on 228 trials across the state of Ohio with corn following soybeans. So this is a tremendous amount of work to derive this information, right? But we can see the nitrogen rates essentially go when nitrogen prices are high and corn prices are low. We're going to recommend that you really back off on nitrogen rates. But when nitrogen fertilizer is low and corn prices are good or better than we normally see, we're going to suggest that you increase your nitrogen fertilizer rate. So that's the whole justification of the whole model. It's again, an economic model. based on nitrogen fertilizer prices, the typical corn nitrogen response, and then the price that you expect to return, that you expect to get for that corn. Okay, again, I told you it was going to be a whirlwind tour. We're now talking about phosphorus, potassium, and this was really the focus of a lot of the work, and we'll spend the most of the time in this video on talking about P and K recommendations. Okay, it's an important concept. Of course, water quality is a big it's occupying a lot of people's attention these days, and we really need to get phosphorus right. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the old framework, and this is some concept, but we'll get into the details here in a bit. So in general, we have fertilizer rate versus soil test level. As our soil test level increase, in general, our fertilizer rates decrease and eventually go to zero. A key feature of this is this critical level, and that's the point where we know we have to apply fertilizer and expect, if it's below that critical level, we need to apply fertilizer, or we have potential for suffering from yield loss. If it's above that, we really don't expect to see any kind of increase in yield based on if we apply fertilizer or not. So we have a critical level, we have this maintenance limit, okay? And then 3 ranges of the build-up, the maintenance, and the drawdown. Okay, so again, this is that 1995 quote-unquote old framework. When it's below that critical level, again, our soils are deficient, a yield response to fertilizer is more likely. When we're above that critical level, that's what we recommend, that's optimal. A yield response to fertilizer is not expected. And then when we're above, even above that, we call that sufficient, which there's really no agronomic reason to apply a fertilizer at this point. What does that mean in terms of the fertilizer rate? Well, for the buildup, it's crop removal plus some extra. So we want to apply what is getting harvested from that crop and export it off that field. But then we want to put a little bit extra so we can bump those soil test levels up into this maintenance range, or that is above the critical level and below the maintenance limit. So when we're in maintenance, our fertilizer rates essentially are crop removal. They approximate crop removal. So we essentially have to put in what we're expecting to yield off that field, what our soil test levels, and then it's going to essentially apply what we're removing, okay? And then drawdown is less than crop removal. So this is a very valid framework. We're keeping to this, 95% is the same. We're just doing a little bit of tweaking to simplify it, okay? So you'll see a lot of similarity here. Fertilizer rate and soil test level. Again, we have a critical level, we have a maintenance limit. Anything below that maintenance limit, we're suggesting crop removal at minimum. When we're below that critical level, again, we're deficient. When we're above it, we're optimal. And when we're above that maintenance limit, we're sufficient. So you'll notice the big difference between these, and then I'll say that this buildup, again, we strongly recommend buildup, but it is essentially optional now. So it's not the only way that we can manage it, at least in the short term, okay? So the old framework on the left, the new framework on the right, very similar. The main differences here, of course, the largest difference is that we've removed that drawdown level from the framework. This, the drawdown is a source of confusion for many growers. There's this widespread misconception that if you're above maintenance limit, then you still need a little bit of additional fertilizer, maybe less than crop removal, but you need something to grow a crop, and that's simply just not the case. We've lots of evidence to suggest that when we're above maintenance limit, it's very, very unlikely to see a crop response, okay? This idea of the buildup being recommended, again, we believe that ultimately managing fertility in this buildup and maintenance philosophy that is outlined here is the most risk adverse and profitable way that we can actually manage nutrients. But we understand there's a lot of reasons that we might want to put that off for a year or two and then only apply fertility for what is needed for crop removal, okay? So what does this mean in terms of timing? The table on the left matches up. It's color-coded with the different phases or assessments on the right in this figure. So when we're deficient, we're in the buildup phase. And we need the crop removal plus extra fertilizer to build those soil test levels up and get them into the maintenance range. And so when we're below that critical level, it's important that we apply fertility immediately before we grow another crop. We're saying the recommendation is apply fertilizer before you grow a crop, because you have a chance of seeing a yield hit if you're not going to fertilize. When we're in that optimal range, again, we are approximating crop removal. So we just apply fertilizer sometime in the rotation. We're not expecting a yield response from that fertilizer, but we're fertilizing to maintain the soil test level. So we're just essentially, replacing what we've removed through crop harvest. And that's the place we want to be. That is what we consider optimal. Sufficient, it's above that maintenance limit. Again, we don't have this drawdown recommendation, but we're not telling you can't fertilize, but we're telling you that there's no agronomic reason to do it. It's highly, highly unlikely that you're going to see a yield response, and you're likely going to, it's not going to be a profitable decision that you're making. Why change this framework? Why go in and tweak it a little bit? There's a few reasons. One is that we wanted to simplify the recs a little bit. I think we've done that. We also understand 25 years ago, soils were sampled much, much different than they are today. Our soil sampling densities have increased tremendously. We have much better tools for understanding soil test levels. We have a large number of labs that provide really great services to provide consistent data. So overall, our uncertainty has really decreased, and we don't need that extra buffer of that drawdown to maintain that. Okay, we understand the majority of cropland in this region is rented, and so sometimes you're not sure if you're going to be renting a field in 1 or 2 years, and you might not want to invest in that, or there might be spikes in fertilizer prices. There's a lot of things that variability here that might factor into some of this decision making. At the end of the day, we were just interested in providing farmers with more options and greater flexibility in terms of managing nutrients. Okay. So again, some more detail. This I'm not going to spend much time on. Malic 3 is now the default extractant. The original recommendations, the 1995 recommendations, were based on Bray phosphorus and ammonium acetate for potassium, calcium, magnesium. Those are two separate extractions. Essentially, 15, 20 years ago, commercial labs started moving to this Malic 3 extractant. It's a very universal extractant. Instead of running two separate extractants on the same soil sample, you can now run one. And this is what labs have been doing for years and decades, really. And so we did a very robust calibration, a few thousand soil samples across multiple states, and compared what Bray to Malic was and what ammonium acetate potassium to Malic potassium K was. So here's your, if you want to convert if you've got a Bray number and you want to go to Malic 3, you simply multiply by 1.35. Same way, if you have an ammonium acetate, you want to go to Malic, you multiply 1.14. So there's more details here. The gory details are at this link here, go.osu.edu/Malic, but we'll leave it for that. We believe this is going to be a change that simplifies the recommendations. It makes, is that Bray Malic or is that Bray phosphorus or Malic phosphorus? We get these kind of questions quite a bit. So instead of running extractants on Malic and back converting to Bray, we're now going to be reporting them in the actual extractant that's used. Okay, so Malic 3 is now the default moving forward. I'm going to talk a little bit about two major pieces for the phosphorus work that kind of inform these new recommendations. Okay, so we have a long-term P&K trials that were on Ohio State farms, and then we've got these on-farm strip trials that I talked about at the very beginning of the talk. Okay, our long-term P&K plots, there's Clark County. These represent essentially, these are on a 3-year agronomy farms and represent kind of major soil regions in the state. So Clark County, Wayne County, Wood County started in 2006, and we've essentially got 3 rates of P fertilizer, 3 rates of K fertilizer. a 0 rate, so that's an unfertilized and cropped since 2006, a 1X, which is essentially we're replacing crop removal. It's so whatever we're removing the crop, that's what we're fertilizing with. And then a 2 to 3 times crop removal. So this would be considered essentially an over-fertilization, okay? It's a corn-soybean rotation. There's a lot to be said about these trials, but I'm gonna just skip to the main points. There's a lot going on here, but I'll walk you through it. So this is soil test phosphorus, okay? We have Malic 3 on the vertical axis, and then we've got years from 2006 to 2018, okay? Our 3 branches, Northwest, this is Wood County, Western, this is Clark County, and Worcester, this is Wayne County, okay? We've got our 3 rates of phosphorus fertilizer. The red is 0, so unfertilized. This kind of light blue is a 1X, so that's at removal rate. And then this darker blue is twice removal rate up until 2016. And that's when we started increasing it to a 3X removal. Okay, so 3 times what we're estimating the removal rate to be. This dashed line is 20 to 40 Malic phosphorus. We'll talk about this in a second. That's essentially our new critical levels. They are what that's the same as they were in the original Tri-States, the Bray equivalent, the Malic equivalent of Bray 15 to 30 part per million, okay? So we can see a few things. One is that the soils didn't really start out highly elevated in phosphorus. They were essentially a little bit above or at recommended rates. And you can see the dynamics over time. Some of these, like for example, in this heavier Hoytville clay soil in Wood County at the Northwest station, we can see that the unfertilized still has not dropped too much, even though we've been continuously cropping in corn and soybeans and not fertilizing over the course of these 13 years, okay? That's quite different than what happens at Western and somewhat different what happens at Worcester. But essentially at the end of the day, you can see these major trends that our fertilizer treatments has differentiated the different levels of soil fertility over each year over these, say 13 or so years. This makes sense. It kind of lines up with what we would hope and kind of what we would predict, okay? But now I want to talk about potassium. So this is the exact same setup. It's the same Northwest, Western, and Worcester, the same fertilizer treatment, except all this is in potassium now. So this is Malic 3 potassium, and our fertilizer treatments are now unfertilized with potassium, at removal with potassium, and then 2 to 3X, okay? And again, across these 13 years. And you can see in general that, say in the instance, well, Northwest, our soils were elevated in K, and even though we see some differences across potassium, these different fertilizer treatments, we see a drop over time, okay, across all 3 of those removal rates. And for example, Western, we can see that there's some kind of maintenance, but essentially a general decline of these rates over time. So the original 1995 Tri-State Fertilizer Recommendations said that it's actually potassium removal rates, it's your crop removal plus an additional 20 pounds. So these values aren't, the fertilization here was not kind of per Tri-State, it was just at removal. So there's recognition, the original authors in 1995 noted that just applying at crop removal, there's essentially more K fixation in the soil that happens, and we're not able to maintain that soil test level. So that shows up here, but it is a little disturbing that even some of these sites, when we're applying 2 to 3 times the removal rates, we're still essentially maintaining or barely maintaining those soil test K values, okay? So this is an area that we've talked to a lot of people, a lot of smart people about, what this means. And there's a lot of unanswered questions here, but we understand and we recognize that it's more difficult to maintain soil test K values than it is soil test P value, soil test phosphorus. So again, this is an area that we have some uncertainty in terms of managing K and thinking about this, okay? But this is just soil test trends. Now let's talk about, the proof in terms of what is actually those crops we're doing. Okay, so I'm going to move to grain yields because, of course, we're not fertilizing potassium solely to maintain soil test K levels. We're essentially, of course, fertilizing potassium and phosphorus to feed that crop. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about grain yields now. Okay, so this is phosphorus grain yields again across these different the different sites in Northwest, Western, and Worcester. We've got corn grain yields on top and soybean grain yields on our bottom. And again, these 3 different fertilizer treatments, okay? Interestingly enough, we look at this red line, this has been cropped for 13 years without fertilizer, and we'd expect big differences based on fertility, and that's just not what we've seen over time, okay? I'm going to put these red lines. This is essentially the year that unfertilized, that red data point, that unfertilized soil test level dropped below critical level. So we'd really expect to start seeing, more and more declines in that unfertilized trial. But we can see here it's clearly not fertility driving the yields. It's more year-to-year likely weather variability that's driving that. Okay, so this is phosphorus. And I'm going to show you the same, it looks like the same data. I assure you it's not. It's potassium data. And so here we've got our 3 different levels of potassium. And again, our different, yields across the years, okay? Our red lines are when we drop below, when that unfertilized drop below the critical level. And really it's here, the main kind of trend that emerges in my mind at least is that with Western yields, we see drops here, consistent drops with this unfertilized, and a little bit in the corn, especially in the latter few years with corn relative to the fertilized. Okay, so we're starting to see it here, but certainly not the case in Northwest that had elevated K levels. And in Worcester, we see some of that, but we just don't see huge differences. So this is a very important lesson, I think, that, so many times we hear you've got to spoon feed crops, to give them what they need at that right time. We just don't really see a lot of evidence of that. That soils are capable, when we put them, when they're in that maintenance range and in that recommended range, they're capable of supplying P and K fertility for many years. Okay, certainly we don't recommend growing crops for 13 years without fertilizing, but in this case, it didn't seem like, for the majority of the sites, it didn't seem like it hurt us too bad doing that, okay? We've run statistics on all these, and I'm just gonna show you when essentially there's a 10% chance that, 90% chance that a yield was increased or decreased based on the fertilizer treatment. So we have, for corn, we had essentially 108 observations where we could compare fertilized versus unfertilized. In soybean, we had 90 observations of fertilized versus unfertilized. For corn, for our phosphorus trials, we can see here that there's 22 cases out of this 108 observations where we saw a yield increase, and actually 3 observations where we saw a yield decrease. For K, 15 observations with a yield increase in soybeans and 4 observations of a yield decrease. So this kind of talks to some, an old adage that corn is typically more responsive to phosphorus and soybean might be a little bit more responsive to potassium, but you can see that both crops are responsive in some regard. Again, we were fertilizing and not fertilizing different treatments, and as those soil test levels drop below that critical level, I took these these different times and broke them out based on the red values when the soil test level was below critical level, and the blue values when it's above. So in other words, 22 observations, we saw an increase in soil test with P fertilization out of this 108. 16 of those times are when those trials were essentially below critical, and 6 levels when they were above. And so I just show this. You can look at, for example, soybeans and K at 12 were below critical level and 3 were when they're above it. So, we do have instances where actually fertilizing, you can see here, fertilizing actually decreased yields, and that can happen for a lot of different reasons. It can be random noise. It can be a salt impact or salt effect, a number of different things. But we understand that critical levels aren't this magic cutoff of, above it and below it, something magic's going to happen. But as a general guide, these 3 long-term trials show that our critical levels that were established in 1995 are actually a pretty good indicator of when you need fertilizer and when you don't. Okay. Now I'm going to shift and talk about P and K from our on-farm strip trials. Again, we ran 5 years of P and K strip trials, and we did this over roughly 33 counties in Ohio. And I'm going to talk first about phosphorus, okay? So we ran 102 trials that were looking at a plus-minus phosphorus treatment. I didn't mention this, but all these trials were randomized and replicated, minimum of 3 replications. So this is kind of a gold standard, okay? We had, of the 102 trials, 54 in corn, 48 in soybean, 34 counties total. We had good yields, on average 192 bushel corn and 48 bushel soybean. Here is the different crops broken out by soil test level, okay? So this is soil test phosphorus and malic part per million. And the wider these bubbles are, the more observations there were. And so we had some, again, these dashed lines are essentially that maintenance range. That's our recommended critical level maintenance limit. So we had some observations certainly below that. Most of the observations were either above critical level or above maintenance. So, given the scenario, we asked for we asked for growers to provide low testing fields, but beggars can't be choosers. And this is really what we got with the growers that came forward to work with us. So most of these fields were either above critical level or even above, so they would be classified as really optimal or sufficient. And in that case, would we expect to see great differences, a lot of yield responses based on a fertilizer, applying fertilizer? And the answer really is no to that. So we'll break it down, and it's important to note 102 trials. There's a lot of detail here. Every one of these trials has its own story. I am painting the absolute broadest brush you can imagine, and so I'm aggregating all the trials together essentially by crop. So 54 trials in corn. Fertilizing with phosphorus essentially gave an extra 3.6 bushels relative to the unfertilized. It ranged from minus 20 bushels to 22 in corn. For soybean, fertilizing with phosphorus gave a 1.3 bushel increase on average, and it ranged from minus 5 to almost 9 bushels, okay? Let's talk about K. We had 81 trials in K in, 32 total counties, okay? So again, you can see the distribution of soil test K for corn and soybeans. We had more observations that were actually below the critical level here, so we'd expect a little bit more of some yield responses, okay? On average, again, good yielding corn and soybean on average. So let's talk a little bit about these trials. Again, broad brush here, but 33 trials in corn. Fertilizing with potassium increased about 4 bushel. But look at the range here, folks. It's minus 44 to nearly 60 bushel increase. And this nearly 60 bushel increase, those are not surprisingly the soils that tested very low. Okay, so we see much larger responses with K fertilization than we do with P, and that's something that we've noted over the years. Soybean, this is curious, right? 48 trials in soybean, on average, fertilizing with potassium fertilizer in soybean produced a minus 0.6 bushel. So it actually decreased yields on average by a half a bushel. It ranged from minus 7 to about 7 bushel, okay? So there just wasn't a huge, and again, this is across the average, but there wasn't a huge amount of trials that were totally responsive, okay? So we've taken all this information, we've taken it from the long-term trials, and we've taken it from all these on-farm trials. We pulled all this together. We ran these statistics and kind of looked at the data in all kinds of ways. I'm going to spare you all the gory details. But really the reality is that we find that our critical levels that were originally established in 1995 are good conservative guides. This is really the new, they're updated, but they're really just updated primarily for reflecting this Malic-3 extractant. So instead of 15 to 30 Bray part per million, it's now, for our kind of maintenance range, it's now 20 to 40. So that's kind of the magic number of what we want our soils in for Malic-3 phosphorus. 20 to 40 part per million is what we recommend that farmers manage their soils in that range. And for wheat and alfalfa, we've verified that they actually, because they're growing at cooler times of the year, less mineralization in that soil, we need a little bit higher levels for wheat and alfalfa, so 30 to 50. For our Malic-3 potassium, those are these two columns here. Sandy soils, which we're defining as less than 5 milliequivalent per 100 grams CEC, 100 to 130 part per million. And then for loamy soils and clayey soils, 120 to 170. So these are kind of the new magic numbers that we're striving and recommending that growers maintain their soils in these. There's a lot of detail in here. There's a lot of devil in those details. I'd highly encourage digging in the recommendations when they're released and kind of reading over. There's just a lot of information that went into this, okay? I'm going to talk very quickly about grain nutrient removal rates. Okay, so with all of these trials, we went and we sampled that grain, we analyzed it for nutrient concentration, and then we could calculate how much actual nutrient was getting removed. You can see this go.ocu.edu grain. That's for more information, okay? So we've got a nutrient concentration, a pound of nutrient per bushel grain that we've published here. And then here's what a typical removal rate would be, at 180 bushel corn, 60 bushel soybean, et cetera, et cetera. Here's a comparison of the 1995 Tri-States in terms of pounds per bushel to the 2020, the new data that we've got, okay? So we can see 37 pounds of P2O5 per bushel of corn in 1995. That's been reduced now to 0.35 pounds per bushel, which is essentially a 5% decrease. So you can see across the board, the grain nutrient concentrations in all three of these crops has dropped. But what's really striking is the amount of potassium, grain potassium concentrations have really dropped 20%, 30%, depending on the crop, okay? So what does this mean? Well, it means that, does it mean that crops need less fertilizer? Not necessarily. This doesn't give us an idea of exactly how much they need, but it gives us an idea of removal rates. And when we're in that, well, again, when we're managing fertilizer in that optimal rate, our removal rates essentially our fertilizer rates approximate removal rates. So there's an opportunity here for plants to, for growers to actually save a little bit on fertilizer costs. Okay, plants are becoming more efficient. There's more presumably starch, carbohydrate, energy in that grain relative to nutrient that's getting exported. And so we've tweaked the fertilizer rates accordingly based on this data. Okay, thousands of grain samples here. This is very robust data. And this is similar to what has been found in other surrounding states. Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota have all found the same general trend. Okay, so we're confident in these results. Wrapping up here, folks, but secondary micronutrients, there's really no major changes. This was not the priority, but we've looked at some of this stuff, and we understand that for the most part, soils in the tri-state typically supply sufficient nutrients for these secondary nutrients and microbes, but there's obviously special cases that exist and do require fertilization, okay? We have no evidence, and we've looked to suggest that micronutrients, there's widespread micronutrient deficiency, or there's widespread sulfur deficiency. again, more information is coming out, but this is something we're monitoring, but for the most part, most soils provide sufficient fertility. To summarize, major changes are core nitrogen rates recommendations have been updated. Framework for P and K fertilizer management has been updated or simplified a bit. Malic 3 is now the default extractant for soil test P and K. Our critical levels for P essentially remain unchanged, with the exception that it's now based in Malic 3. Critical levels for K are simplified into 2 CEC classes. The nutrient removal rates per bushel, right? That's important. The removal rate on a per bushel basis has decreased, especially with potassium, all right? With that, I just want to thank my co-authors on this. Is again a tremendous amount of work. This is not an exhaustive list. There's lots of growers, lots of county educators or folks that really were fundamental in generating the data that went into this. Really need to acknowledge the funding source here: Ohio Soybean Council, Corn and Wheat Checkoff. These were the primary drivers of funding for this project, and this is your checkoff dollars at work. So without that investment, that contribution, we would still be working with fertilizer recommendations that were 25 years old. So our time frame here, within the next say month or so, the document has been vetted many times by a lot of diverse stakeholder groups. It's at publishing right now. It's getting laid out. It's going to be released. And I'm sure if you're tuned into the local ag news, the Ohio State Corn newsletter or other outlets, you will hear about this. But sometime in the summer of July or August of 2020, these are going to be officially released and ready to use. Thank you for your time. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I'll end there.